Hi there. In Chapter 29 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Phaedrus illustrates how Plato is responsible for the very first step in creating the object-oriented understanding of reality we now hold, that places truth as the highest principle, and that this was achieved by usurping the spotlight from quality, or arete, as it was known in ancient Greece. So here's my interpretation of that section of Chapter 29. Rhetoric in ancient Greece was not a technique in the sense that we know it today. Aristotle created rhetorical technique out of what Plato did to rhetoric in the Gorgias dialogue, or Gorgias. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that. Rhetoric was once the method of linguistic expression of excellence, meaning that since there is not necessarily a fixed truth, and the example given in this section is a political and budgetary concern, that either ships should or should not be added to the Greek Navy. And concerns like this, as we know today, certainly have two sides. There's definitely a case for both sides. It's the rhetorician's job to make a case for the person who wants to promote one argument or the other, and the rhetorician can help two different people, for example. So it was his job to put himself in the mindset of that particular viewpoint, for or against the ships, for example. And then from that viewpoint, from that empirical place of that viewpoint, generate an analogy of it. The art was in the ability to convey the emotional experience of that viewpoint in the best, most salient way. So when politicians today say disparagingly that their opponents are using rhetoric, they're right. The assumption pertaining to rhetoric is that truth is secondary and emotional appeal is primary, and they're right here too. But remember, there really isn't a fixed truth, and we see this today. There are very few occasions in which there's a fixed truth. They're generally very narrow parameters in scientific experiment or mathematics or something like that. So rhetoric can be used in service of the bad, which is to persuade someone to change his mind for the betterment of the persuader, without necessarily a desire for what is best. But if you have that desire for what is best, it can be used in service of the good to honestly convey what one genuinely feels is best in a particular context, in a particular situation, or for all of mankind, it may be, who knows. So what happens in the Gorgias dialogue is Plato forces Gorgias to create this list of attributes of rhetoric, and then he calls that list, these fragments, the whole. So in doing so, in cutting up the holistic mechanism of rhetoric into these attributes, he kills it. He kills the essential generative nature of rhetoric. Ultimately, Aristotle renames it as a technique, which is composed of this list. Part of this sleight of hand, the sneaky tactic, is to call quality, arete, the driving force of rhetoric, ambiguous by showing how quality is different things for different people. And this further promotes this hatchet job. But the fact of the matter is, Plato understands that quality is indeed very unambiguous. He knows this. But in order to do what he needs to do, he has to demote quality. And the only way to do this is flip the nature of reality from truth being generated by quality, from truth being a more pragmatic truth, the best possible way of looking at things for a particular context, which is really how truth operates in reality, to quality is a subservient idea below truth. It's the next best thing. Truth is the is the primary principle in which we need to think and operate, and quality, the good, maybe supports truth. We want truth in service of the good, but truth is preordinate and quality is subordinate. But an axiom of the ancients, the pre-Socratics, was that arete, excellence, was the essence of reality, and that truth was what is best. This is also the direction that Phaedrus is going in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, is to revive this understanding of reality. So that's the birth of the ghost of reason. And Phaedrus finds, when he discovers where the ghost of the reason originates, he angrily discovers that this ghost of reason has lodged itself in, almost to the point of being innate. In fact, that it is innate in his own mind, kind of like an infection. And that infection is one that humanity has been passing on for 2,000 plus years. So no wonder he has a breakdown. According to Phaedrus, quality, arete, again, is axiomatic. So when Gorgias responds to Socrates that the words of rhetoric are of the greatest, of the best, he's talking about arete. And in the margin of the book that Phaedrus is reading in this process of discovery of the ghost of reason, when Gorgias says that rhetoric is in service of the greatest, he writes the word true in the margin. But when Socrates says that it's ambiguous, Phaedrus writes liar. And that is the case. And we know that Socrates, being a pre-Socratic himself, perfectly well understood what was meant by arete, by quality, by the good. So when he says it's ambiguous, that is a load of bullshit. And Phaedrus is right. So we actually see this same kind of mechanism that originated in Plato. Now understand, Plato had the best intentions, but he had a motivated reason for making truth preordinate to good. So we're not saying that that particular sleight of hand was in service of something particularly bad, but it was a sleight of hand, and it was a mechanism to create a new reality. And this is a motivated approach. This means that you have a preconceived notion of what you want, and then you use rhetoric in service of that. So that is rhetoric, as we were saying before, rhetoric in service of the bad, the ill. And we certainly see this motivated approach today, obviously on a much smaller scale than the restructuring of reality that occurred in that moment with Socrates and Gorgias, but the sleight of hand nonetheless. Socrates used this tactic to elevate truth above quality. He had a goal in mind, and he used the exchange to further this goal and to redefine quality. And that's the key point I want to highlight. It's the same in many things you see in the cultural war. They start with motivation. They start with a desired outcome. So there's a very good illustration of this these days in the redefinition of a particular word. And that word is racism. So what I would like to do is first read the definition of racism from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Definition of racism: a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So racism has been redefined by both sides of the culture war. For the sake of argument, we're just going to call those right and left. So the right calls the CRT, the critical race theory mechanism, is disparaging white people, and the right calls this anti-white racism. But this isn't exactly right, because in the definition we noticed that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So there isn't any claim, from what I can see in CRT, that white people cause the problems because of their phylogenics. They cause the problems more on a social level. So the definition of just to call this anti-white stance racism is a little bit disingenuous because it is more of a social definition rather than a phylogenic definition. Racism implies that the maligned group has been historically denied rights due to their race. This has historically been disparaged. So if the brown and black proponents, let's just say, I mean, there's plenty of white ones too, of critical race theory, have a problem with whites, it's not because there is anything within these racial categories that one is superior and one is inferior. So that would imply that the black and brown people are phylogenetically superior to whites for this to be anti-white racism. So that means that this definition from the right is way too narrow and way too simplistic. In contrast, the left has made the definition so ambiguous and broad that almost anything that the proponents of CRT object to can be categorized as racism under this unbelievably ambiguous and broad definition. And I'm going to use Ibrahim Kendi's definition of racism. Racism is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. That is not a definition. That's what has been criticized as as a circular definition, using the word racist to define racism. But he does tell us what racist policies are. So are we hopeful? Are we going to get a little bit more into it? No. He says a racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. There are so many factors in a policy that can produce racial inequity. So that's a trap to put anything in there, any policy you want, that could in any way measuring inequity, and in what way are you going to measure it? So it just opens up the floodgates for interpretation, let's say, and that's motivated interpretation. So you've got two definitions, one on the left and one on the right, both of them wrong. So both sides are using sneaky tactics to redefine racism for their own ends. Now, this next thought is a little off point, but somehow reminds me of this tactic. I'm not quite sure how to map it on, but it reminds me of it. I was watching the great film Chinatown the other night, and toward the end, the corrupt businessman, Noah Cross, played by John Huston, informs the detective who's on to him, who's played by Jack Nicholson. It's one of those Scooby-Doo moments, where he says, where he confesses his crime, but he's in a particular situation where he's got a guy with a gun, and so he admits to Jack Nicholson what he's been doing because he knows he has nothing to lose. He's got this guy, backing him up with a gun. Noah Cross says to Giddies that the way he will justify what he's been doing, which is diverting water from LA to the arid San Fernando Valley, which he wants to be fertile to enrich himself, with a dam paid for by the LA taxpayers, is to simply integrate the valley, to pay people off in the government and integrate the valley into LA County, so that San Fernando Valley becomes part of the LA County tax base. It's a deceitful practice, but it reflects gerrymandering and redlining. Those are versions of that. So let's go back to Plato, who kind of illustrated how this can be done. And it seems like much of who we are and how we operate in the world was set up in the ancient Greeks and Plato. And so maybe anyone who thinks we ought to get rid of the classics for whatever woke reason might want to think twice, because to understand ourselves, we have to understand where our ideas come from. And whether what happened in the Gorgias dialogue is a good thing or bad thing, it did happen. and we need to understand ourselves. And so any notion of getting rid of the classics is absolutely ludicrous. The people who are going to suffer the most from not understanding human motivation are the people who will lose the most, if you know what I mean. So be careful when you want to get rid of the origins of human thought for very superficial reasons. So as a final thought, there are strident declarations as to what our biggest threat is in this country. And this isn't particularly related to the things I've been saying, although it's somewhat related. These are all this stuff is interrelated. So the biggest threat in our country, it's not immigration, it's not white supremacy, it's not COVID, it's not critical race theory, it's not even China. Our biggest threat is division. That the reason this is the biggest threat is because this division is making us weak. It's so much so that any of these problems, immigration, white supremacy, to what extent that actually exists, COVID, China, and all that stuff, is we're more prone to falling prey to these things if we're divided. And there's a perfect example of it. The fact that we would rather hold up tribal narratives that kill people rather than unite and come to the best solution is an absolute demonstration of how this division is going to undermine us if we don't solve it soon. Because the left was so adamant in opposing Trump at all costs, treatments for COVID that might be effective were ignored and people died. Because the right was so adamant in opposing Fauci, people belligerently congregated in large groups way before it was prudent to do so, and maskless, and people died. So let's go back and look at these two definitions of racism. Racism isn't the narrow, back-at-ya definition of the right in which whites are necessarily being maligned due to racism. And it's not the ambiguous systemic racism that implies the system is purposely against black and brown people because of the color of their skin. And it's everywhere. If there's any confusion about the definition, take the time to go back to the original definition, look it up in the dictionary, and see how these definitions measure up. You will see that they've been redefined for a political agenda. You're actually going to find very few people who fit into the actual definition of racism. And generally, each side is going to dig up those few people and highlight them. Also, it's important to note that the truth is permeable and static at the same time, and is always somewhere in between dichotomous, tribalistic declarations. So I hope that makes sense, and I'll see you next time.